many of you are looking at, not many of you are actually looking at media per se. So, in a sense, this is a taste for you maybe to think about the kind of resonances of narrative research for media studies. But also, I think media is a cool way of reminding us a bit about the structures of narrative and the ways in which we, take effort to kind of inscribe and write and create images in narrative ways. So I suppose if you're not doing media, this is a way of thinking again about what narrative structures do. And so I'm going to reiterate, I'm going to kind of work through a few things that I think will be helpful for you to engage with. So media is a really rich space for thinking about narrative. And I suppose the argument I'm putting across here is that media and narrative are co-constitutive. So it'd be hard-pressed to think about media that doesn't draw in storytelling, audiences, narration, plot, fate, you name it. It's all kind of there. So I'm quite interested in, the ways in which narrative and media co-organize, rely on each other, are assembled together in enormously creative ways. And I think, we can think about narrative's richness when we embark on an analysis like this. I'm quite impressed, that one of the things I want to kind of emphasize is how, media solves narrative problems, how to stage a narrative to persuade, entertain, compel, sell. Media analysts are constantly coming up with clever ways of doing that, constantly thinking of new ways to inscribe. And as our media environment has become more complex because of digital media, social media, globalization, polyphony, etc., narrative practices have, morphed in this environment. So I want to talk, as I was saying, to sort of go back to some kind of principles about media and narrative, some principles about narrative that I think can help, that like there's a kind of toolbox or a kind of key set for opening up an analysis of narrative in media. So I want to look at symbols and time, and that basic principles about what narrative is and how that kind of structure segues into all kinds of media that we can see. I also want to draw attention to morals and affect, so that all kinds of media draw in moralizing, characterizing plot lines, and also emotion and affect. I don't know if many of you have talked about it so far, but I think one of the compelling things about media narratives is how they depict and enjoin people into emotional experience. So I'm quite interested in just alerting you to those things. And as someone who's actually a social scientist and spends a lot of time talking to people about lived experience, these practices of making narratives are kind of, in evidence in the stories that people make about their lives. Then I want to talk about continuing this theme about narrative complexity and talk a bit about story worlds and the kind of the multiplication of stories or the convergence of stories across different kinds of media. And I'm going to look at contagion, infection, pandemics as an example. And then I'd like us to have a discussion about that. Following that, I want to make some points about ethics and politics. So one of the tensions that media brings up is this relationship between fact and fiction, art and life, politics and ethics. So media always asks us those questions when we consume a story and create a story. And it's in the news, or it's a fictionalized account of life. The kind of what is the power, what is the social potency of that storytelling? And I want us to think about how narratives can be extremely political and ethical, and that attending to that is really important. And in relation to that, I want to also talk about a little bit about genre. So the example I want to use for ethics is around survivor narrative, and hopefully that will stimulate some good discussion. So just very, very initially, symbols and time. So as a starting point for my conceptualization of what media does is to go back to this kind of, inclusive kind of definition that works across lived experience narratives, the kinds of political narratives that Molly talked about, but also in media. And so this basic concept that narratives can be staged in all kinds of media, and that the kind of basic concept is this kind of procession of symbols that give meaning, that enable meaning. So I've got an amusing example here, which I think works really well graphically. It's not surprising. So it's a cartoon that kind of really obviously emphasizes what this idea of narrative progression, the construction of symbols, the use of image, the use of text, and the staging of a kind of, space and characters. And there's also, actually, there's quite a lot of complexity, even in this tiny little storyline. But I suppose the point I'm making here is how inventive different kinds of media have been in sort of solving the problem of how to tell a story. So cartoon is one, but there are all manner of ways in which different media forms kind of take up, the idea of constructing a narrative and making it meaningful. And I think we can start to see, even a kind of Twitter feed, a Twitter thread, the kind of storytelling we're seeing around different issues in social media kind of borrows from some of these conventions, people chunking their story and staging it and maybe revealing something at the end of their thread, etc. So those kind of curated stories occurring in social media and other spaces. So the other concept I want to establish, because I think it's one of the kind of touchstones for me when I think about narrative analysis, and that's to think about how it's peopled with certain kinds of archetypes, moral archetypes. So the kind of formalists, the people who are interested in structures of narrative, gave us a kind of, a literary history of how folk tales, children's stories, fairy stories, etc., have identifiable elements that are reorganized continuously to create different kinds of stories. So this kind of, looking for a narrative, looking for the narrative qualities of a media text or even an interview text. What are the recognizable kind of storytelling strategies that emulate the kind of folktale kind of methods? So classically, the hero, victim, villain sort of kind of set of characters that embody goodness, evil, and victimhood, and how those identities are kind of reformulated, in a kind of classic way in television reinventing the kind of fairy story for us, for adults, peopled with complex characters, but that still draw in that kind of basic structure. So I look, when I interview people and they talk about people in their lives, and I like to think about, you know, the kind of moral position they take in their story. How do they locate themselves in a moral universe? Do they, you know, construct themselves as heroes, as a victim or villain, or some combination of those things? And I think kind of villainy and heroism and victimhood need not be attached to a particular character. It can be other, you know, agential forces in the storylines. But I look for these kind of strategies, these storytelling strategies, when I think about narratives. So one of the things that stories do is to kind of create, you know, depict and evaluate fate. So a story has a plot, which, you know, begins and there's a middle and there's an end, and things happen and people think about it. So often, even in an interview, I hear people evaluating, you know, things that have happened to them in their lives. So even though people might not give you an intact story, elements of this kind of evaluation of fate might occur in the storyline. And I suppose the point here is that media, because of its richness, because of its ubiquity, because of the constant replaying and reorganizing of all sorts of media narrative structures, you know, these are the kind of, this is the cultural toolbox that people are enmeshed in and draw in to make sense of experiences. So evaluating themselves as the victim of a particular thing that happened and working out how to become the hero of that storyline draws in the kind of folktale structures. I also really like thinking narratively about media and my social science research, because I think narratives create that relationship between the narrator and the listener. So there's always a, you know, narratives imply an imagined or real kind of audience, and media narratives really emphasize that. You know, media narratives are constructed to create audiences, some of whom will purchase those storylines. So I think that that's why narratives give us a more of a kind of sociological basis for thinking about lived experience, because, you know, other forms of qualitative analysis, you have to bring in relationships, you have to bring in emotion. But if you're attending to how people address you or an imagined audience through you, and how they talk about emotions and advise, you know, instruct you about emotions, but then also how you might be moved by what they say anyway, is all playing in the kind of narrative experience. And that happens when we consume media narratives too. So I think understanding how narrative works in different kinds of media really enlivens how we might analyze other kinds of narrative texts. So that's the sort of, you know, analytical toolbox that I use when I'm doing my kind of analysis of narratives. But there's another kind of set of issues that we could think about in terms of how complicated our media worlds are. And because I've written a book about pandemics, that's what I'm going to talk about. And this is this concept of story worlds. So this is this notion that the kind of repetition, the citing of, the reworking of, the kind of reworking of different kinds of media presentations of stories creates a kind of culture around a particular plot line or idea. And pandemics are a really, really good example. So if we look at the books that have been written about pandemics, there's quite a few, and I've contributed to that effort. some of which are, academic texts, some of which sort of sit in the middle with kind of journalist academics writing about particular events, through to the kind of fictionalized narratives. We add in, not just kind of the long form text, but then start thinking about film and the digital media environment. We start to see how something's, for example, the kind of pandemic story is repeated and repeated so often that we come to understand it as a kind of pandemic culture. So the different stories that are being told in different media borrow from each other, refer to each other, cite each other, to kind of, reiterate, to draw us into this story world. To some extent, the different stories gain meaning and may only be intelligible in the context of the other stories that have been told about contagion. What's interesting about Defoe is that, he wrote a very early book about the plague in London. He was a journalist in the traditional sense. So I did, one of the concepts I played with in my book was the extent to which the concept of a pandemic through media creates us as a collective. The fact that we all are threatened in some way by an infectious agent that spreads throughout the social body, creates a public of interest in defending itself from that threat. So, I think pandemics are a good example of story worlds, but they bring this other kind of resonance in for what it means to be a member of the public, to be an audience of this story world, particularly if we think about the last 2 years and how intensely mediatized COVID has been. So these pandemic stories have been with us for a long time, and they're being kind of reorganized and reiterated. And all of the elements I've talked about already, symbols and time, characterizations, the good and the bad and in between, affect, all of those story elements you will see across these kinds of different forms of pandemic stories. And I guess I want to say provocatively, I want to raise a question here about story worlds and reality. It's a kind of ontological question about meaning, our consumption of these media stories about different kinds of pandemics, this kind of education of the body politic about what contagion means and politically and interpersonally and socially, and then how we deal with a pandemic like COVID. So what I want us to do now is I want to show you a fragment from the film Contagion. So this is the Soderbergh film that was released in 2010. For those of you who may not be that clear about that period of time, we had something called the swine flu pandemic in 2009-10. And just as that pandemic kind of turned into a kind of, mild infection, Soderbergh released this film Contagion. And in it explores the pandemic story world, energized around what happened in swine flu and previously SARS, but never actually making literal kind of reference to those particular infections. As someone who was looking at all the policy about pandemic, looking at all the storytelling, the film is like a museum for me. It's a museum of all the technology and assumptions and science and politics of managing a pandemic. So I think it's an impressive text, an impressive way to tell a story that's both compelling and entertaining and emotional, but also deeply political and ethical in his kind of stance about how to respond to the pandemic. So the fragment, I'm not going to make you watch the whole film. You'll be glad to know, but I've selected a little fragment which I want you to think about. I'm going to show you, and then I'll put you into small groups to talk about these questions. So in the extract I've got for you, there's this journalist talking about his work, giving the alternative story about what the pandemic, this fictionalized pandemic of contagion, actually means. Talking about conspiracy and false cures. And I want us all to look out for how this story is told and what are the resonances for us post-COVID. So, you know, how are symbols and time and morals and affect woven together in this tiny fragment? How is this journalist characterized as a moral agent? Trust emerges in this fragment. In fact, also immunity, my current kind of fixation, emerges here too in a really interesting way. And I want to ask you, you know, how and does and how the fragment resonate with COVID-19? And therefore, is this fiction? Is it a document of fact or something else? I want us to ponder what these media narratives actually mean. So to do this, I need to stop and find the video. There's lots of comments. Oh, people talking about me. Okay, hang on. Let me find this. Brilliant. I'm on my iMac blew up today, so I'm on my laptop. I've got a tiny laptop playing here, so it's a little bit fiddly. And there's a prize for guessing what this accent is, for the journalist's accent. So remember, what's going on here? How is the story told? How does it resonate? You know, what's the status of this narrative text in terms of fiction, fact, and something else?
The big vapor rub people, the Lysol people, look it up. One man dies, another man makes money off his coffin. One country culls all their chickens, red meat goes into higher demand. I'm not the first person to make money off the fact that our immune system is a work in progress. The pharmaceutical industry do it every quarter.
I don't think anyone is immune to opportunity, Alan. It's just that the studies show that there is no proof that Forsythia works.
Who conducted the studies? What defines works? Against what strain of the virus?
Did you know about the studies when we met the last time? We can get in a lot of trouble.
You really think this Dr. Hextall CDC person is Jesus in a lab coat? The government rushed the trials. The lawyers indemnified the drug companies. Maybe it causes autism or narcolepsy or cancer 10 years from now. Who knows? The swine flu vaccine killed people back in 1976. Nerve disease. So we're all guinea pigs starting from today. Just wait. They'll start listing side effects like the credits at the end of a movie.
People trust you, Alan. If you tell them not to take it.
That's right. They trust me. All 12 million unique visitors. I'm a trusted man stepping up to a microphone in front of a very large crowd. That's who I am. That's the brand. I say the right thing. Nobody shows up for their shot. Maybe they'd rather roll the dice with Forsythia. I can make that happen. I just want to know I'm in the best position possible when I do.
What does that mean exactly?
I'm going to step into the crosshairs. I want to know what's in it. Is he with you?
What? Who?
Are you wearing a wire?
Alan, I didn't have a choice. They've seen your blog.
For what? Tell me for what?
Security fraud? Conspiracy and most likely manslaughter.
He's cured me. Forsythia cured me.
We'll see, Alan.
This is entrapment. You can't take my blood. You can't. That's my property.
Good. Okay. So I think it would be good to put us into small groups. Do people tolerate me being a teacher for a little while? Maybe groups of, how many are we? Wow. Groups of 5. Corinne, what do you think?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah.
Great way for people to meet some more people also. So
I reckon, yeah.
Yeah.
And your mission is to deconstruct the film, the extract. Think about it narratively. Think about it in terms of its resonance for COVID and this kind of relationship between, you know, a fictionalized account that draws in facts and how it contributes to a story world, and therefore questions about, you know, the stories we're telling about COVID, how do they link back into this kind of history of storytelling? So I'm going to break you automatically into 5 groups. Hang on. 5 groups, and give you 10 minutes to chat that through and bring you back. And then I'd really like to hear what your group came up with. And of course, there'll be other questions that you will have kind of come up with, and we can kind of kick those around, have our discussion, and then we'll move on to the other exercise. So I'm about to create you into breakout. So I'll see you in 10 minutes.